When doctors get a headache, doctors don't buy expensive branded ibuprofen. Doctors buy cheap, generic ibuprofen because doctors know the active ingredients are identical. So why waste money on expensive branded ibuprofen that works the same way as the cheap generic medications that are 10 times cheaper? Unfortunately, when it comes to buying investments, doctors are not so savvy with their choices. In this video, I'm going to show you how doctors and dentists are wasting at least £10 million buying expensive branded active investments. Even worse, unlike ibuprofen, where the expensive branded ibuprofen performs the same as the cheap generic ibuprofen, the generic investment options available are not only cheaper, but also have historically performed better than the expensive actively managed branded investments, but only if you know where to look. How can doctors be making such expensive mistakes with their investing? As we're going to see, it's a toxic combination of doctors' trusting nature combined with doctors' lack of financial education that is exploited by some financial salespeople, all wrapped up in an endorsement from some medical schools and royal colleges. In this video, I'm going to show you how to avoid making these mistakes, and I've put some links in the show notes below. Here's a chart that shows how a branded, actively managed investment from a restrictive financial advisor has performed. Just saying those words, active management, restrictive financial advisor, is like kryptonite for me. And I'm going to explain why it should be like kryptonite for you. In grey, we have the expensive, actively managed growth fund from the restrictive financial advisor. In yellow, we have the performance of other funds in this sector, which you'll see is better than the growth fund. In black, we have the performance of an international benchmark, the cheap, passively managed generic tracker. This cheap generic tracker costs you 9 times less than the expensive, actively managed investment, but has performed better, historically speaking. Why? Well, it's partly because the cheap generic option is what's known as a passive investment. Passive investments believe that buying a small part of all of the best companies in the world and doing nothing is the best way to invest. In contrast, the active, expensive investment believe an expensive fund manager trying to predict the future is the best way to get investment returns. Guess what? Predicting the future is very, very hard, and the majority of expensive, actively managed investments underperform over the long term, despite charging much higher fees. As Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, said, "Don't look for the needle, just buy the haystack." But you're looking at this chart thinking, well, the performance of the expensive investment isn't great, but how bad could it be? Well, let's have a look at what £10,000 invested 5 years ago would look like. In blue, we have the cheap, generic option. And in gold, we have the expensive branded investment. This table here shows you that if you'd invested £10,000 5 years ago into the cheap option, you would have £17,506 after fees today. Contrast that to the super expensive actively managed fund, and you would have just £13,567 today, or £3,939 less. And maybe you're thinking, well, it doesn't sound too bad, does it? Let's have a look how these small differences in percentages add up to hundreds of thousands of pounds over a typical investing timeframe. To do that, we're going to use the MedicsMoney financial dashboard. This dashboard comes with our financial wellbeing course and has everything that you need to manage your finances so that you can make better financial decisions. The homepage here shows you all the key financial metrics that you ought to be tracking, and this is personalized to you so you can actually see what your finances are doing in real time. I'm not going to look at that tab. I'm also going to skip past the net worth tab, which shows you how your wealth is growing over time. I'm going to skip past the budgeting tab, which shows you a breakdown of where your valuable money goes and how you can divert more of this money into buying assets and not liabilities. I'm also going to skip past the debt tab, which helps you to repay your debt in a logical order. I'm going to skip past the tax tab, which shows you how much tax you should pay, calculates your adjusted net income, and allows you to fiddle around with this to see how you can save tax. I'm going to skip past the pensions tab, which allows you to put your own pensions number in to model how much pension you get at retirement and allow you to start making a long-term financial plan, assuming that you don't want to work all the way to 67 or 68. And I'm going to go to the simplest tab of all, compound interest. And I'm going to look at the typical investment. So remember, the passively managed fund over the last 5 years had a 12% annualized return. Using a typical investing time frame of 40 years and a typical investing amount of £200, after 40 years at 12%, that would get you £2.3 million. Not bad. Let's contrast that to the performance of the super expensive actively managed fund, which you'll remember had an annualized return over the last 5 years of 8%. Assuming the 8% return, you don't get £2.3 million, you get £703,000. That is a £1.6 million difference. But you're thinking, well, maybe the actively managed fund was unlucky for the last 5 years. Let me show you why most actively managed funds struggle to beat these super cheap passive trackers over the long term. And one word, fees. The super expensive branded investment that we just showed you on the restricted financial advisor will cost you 1.79% of the amount you invest per year, plus 3% of the initial amount. If you don't think that sounds too expensive, keep watching, and I'm about to show you how this is costing doctors and dentists millions. In contrast to those fees, the super cheap passively managed generic tracker is available for 0.2% a year, or nearly 9 times cheaper than that super expensive actively managed investment, which has historically underperformed. And that's without taking into account the one-off 3% fee for the expensive branded investment. Here's what a 2% difference looks like over 40-year investing time frame, assuming an investment of £200 a month again. Over 40 years, those extra fees on the actively managed investment equate to £102,000 of money lost to fees, or approximately 26% of the total amount. But according to the company's website, doctors have over £40 million invested in this actively managed super expensive fund. So 26% lost of 40 million is £10.4 million of doctors and dentists' money that have been lost to fees in this super expensive actively managed fund from the restrictive financial advisor. The more technically minded among you might be interested to know that the Sharpe ratio of the expensive branded investment is 0.07 and the cheap generic benchmark is 0.59. The Sharpe ratio is just a measure of risk-adjusted returns, with higher numbers indicating less risk relative to return. So the actively managed expensive branded investment from the restrictive financial advisor performs worse, historically speaking, costs more, and you take more risk to get those lower returns, which is actually worse than buying generic ibuprofen, because at least the branded ibuprofen doesn't perform worse than the generics. What can we do to help doctors and dentists avoid making these mistakes? One word: education. Doctors just need to learn the basics of investing, how much you should pay, what investments you might consider buying, and why. And learning that is significantly easier than being a doctor or dentist. Trust me, I know. In the show notes below, I've put some links to resources that can help you to learn how to invest and avoid making these expensive mistakes, and all of this information comes from a reputable source. If you like these videos, don't forget to hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. And if you've got any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.